Russia says it's firmly opposed to any temporary ceasefires in its war with Ukraine, throwing the future of the peace process into doubt.
Well, President Putin says Russia will not retreat from Ukraine and give away anything that belongs to us.
Putin is refusing to end the war because at this point, Russia has become dependent on the war for survival. Despite both Zelensky and even Trump coming to the negotiation table, Putin is dragging his feet and refusing to have fruitful peace talks. Even within Russia, the people are tired of fighting. Wealthy oligarchs are quietly frustrated as they shoulder the financial burden, while everyday Russians struggle with rising prices for basics like food. The war casualties have reached almost 1 million, and yet the war rages on. The sad truth is that Russia simply cannot afford to end the war. It has become a war economy, and if they make peace, all signs point to a post-war economic collapse that will destroy Russia. To better understand this idea, let's look at these reasons why Russia is still on its feet and why it has been placed in such a difficult position. The first thing is naturally manpower. In the early days of the war, you probably remember the bleak headlines about many young Russians forced to fight in Ukraine due to heavy troop losses. To keep its army strong without conscription, the Russian government then introduced voluntary military contracts. These contracts offer high pay and extra benefits, making the military one of the better career options available. For many young men who had once had little hope for a stable future, joining the military has become a way to improve their lives, support their families, and gain respect in their communities. In Moscow, a newly signed soldier gets a one-time bonus of 1.9 million rubles, which is about $21,783, roughly. Their monthly salary starts at 210,000 rubles, or $2,407, which adds up to over 5.2 million rubles, or $59,616 per year. Compared to Russia's average monthly salary of 73,000 rubles, or $837, contract soldiers earn a lot more. These high wages have made it easier for Russia to recruit soldiers. In 2024, over 440,000 soldiers signed up, 107% more than the government's goal. Military offices across the country are packed with applications, as many people sign up for long-term service in exchange for financial stability, housing, healthcare, and many other benefits. The Kremlin's new recruitment strategy is a clever move. By offering attractive salaries, they're encouraging volunteer enlistment, which helps avoid the backlash they faced in 2022 when they tried to force people into the military through conscription. This approach not only motivates soldiers with fair pay, but also provides financial stability for their families. With more volunteers, Russia can focus on training and equipping its troops rather than dealing with reluctant draftees. This shift has also created unexpected opportunities for those who stay behind. Local economies in poorer regions like Siberia are transforming as thousands of men leave to fight, and businesses are now offering higher wages to attract employees. Interestingly, this shift has contributed to Russia's economic growth, with GDP rising by 4% in the second quarter of 2024. However, it's essential to note that this growth is largely driven by military production, which may not be sustainable in the long term.
Now, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world, and yet this year its economy is set to grow faster than all advanced economies, according to the International Monetary Fund.
And because of this economic growth, the World Bank has even classified Russia as a high-income country. Other industries like manufacturing, farming, and construction have also had to raise wages because of the shrinking workforce. This gives workers more bargaining power and better pay. However, this economic boost might not last. If the war stops, thousands of soldiers would come back to a job market that can't support them, leading to unemployment and anger. Many veterans would need expensive healthcare and financial help for injuries or mental health issues, putting more pressure on the government. As good as the war's benefits seem, like economic growth and national pride, if Russia makes peace, everything could fall apart. The country would face huge challenges like creating jobs and paying for social programs, which could lead to instability. For now, keeping the war going might feel like the easier choice, even though it comes at a high cost. As for the working class, a similarly unusual situation is developing for them. Because so many men have joined the military, there are fewer people available to work regular jobs. This has forced employers to raise wages to attract workers, which has been a rare win for ordinary Russians. At the same time, the war has created a huge demand for military supplies like weapons, vehicles, and ammunition. Factories are working non-stop to meet this demand, and they need more workers too. This has led to higher wages, more job opportunities, and unemployment hitting record lows. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. Now, the spike in higher wages may seem like good news for workers, but they come with a hidden cost: inflation. By December of 2024, inflation hit 9%, making everyday needs like food, clothes, and even gas more expensive. On the other hand, even though prices are rising, wages have been growing even faster, which means many workers are still seeing their real incomes go up. But economists are worried that this isn't going to last forever. The problem is that wages are going up, but workers aren't becoming more productive. This mismatch could create an economic bubble, which might burst and cause problems down the road. While rising wages might look like a win for workers, this trend is creating ripple effects far beyond paychecks. Russia's job market is feeling the strain as businesses scramble to fill positions left empty by departing soldiers. As of December 2023, there were 2.3 million job openings across the country. With so many jobs available and fewer workers to fill them, companies have had to raise wages to attract employees. Over the past year, wages in the private sector have gone up by 8 to 20%. Depending on the industry. At the same time, the unemployment rate has dropped to just 2.9%, the lowest it's ever been. This shows how intense the competition for workers has become. The sheer scale of the war in Ukraine has pushed Russia into a war economy, with massive spending on defense and military production. While this has strained the country overall, it's created unexpected opportunities for the working class. Between 2023 and mid-2024, around 600,000 people joined defense factories, bringing the sector's workforce to 3.8 million. Yet, there's still a shortage of 160,000 workers in military plants, showing just how high the demand for labor has become. To attract workers, companies are offering higher wages and stepping up recruitment efforts, giving many Russians better pay and job options than they've seen in years. However, labor crunch has forced Russia to rely heavily on migrant workers to keep the economy running. For example, the Vologda region tried to ban migrants from construction jobs, but businesses quickly pushed back, leading to the ban being reversed. This highlights how deeply the war has reshaped Russia's economy, pulling in young workers for the military while leaning on migrants to fill the gaps left behind. You might be thinking, this surge in jobs and wages feels like a win for many workers, right? But it comes with an expiration date. When the war ends, the demand for military supplies will drop, and so will the government contracts that are keeping these factories busy. Factories that are running non-stop right now might slow down or even shut down, leading to layoffs and lower wages. This could leave a lot of workers suddenly struggling to make ends meet, which could make them angry and frustrated with the government. Russia's war in Ukraine has put a massive strain on the country's budget, forcing the government to find new ways to raise money. One of the biggest moves has been to tax large corporations more heavily. In 2023, Russia introduced a windfall tax on businesses making over 1 billion rubles in annual profits. This tax was meant to bring in around 300 billion rubles, which is about $5.3 billion, to help pay for the war. While ordinary Russians are also feeling the economic pain, the richest people in the country are bearing the brunt of these new taxes. The government's message is clear. No one, not even the wealthiest, is safe from the costs of war.
Tonight, the Biden administration says they want Vladimir Putin and the people around him to feel the squeeze in a new round of sanctions. The White House made the announcement as they tightened the economic noose around the necks of more Russian oligarchs and their families.
Western sanctions have made things even harder for Russia's oligarchs, the ultra-rich businessmen who control much of the country's economy. These sanctions include freezing their assets, cutting them off from international banking systems, and banning them from doing business in Europe and the US. As a result, Russian billionaires have lost access to global markets and struggle to maintain their wealth. The impact has been huge. In 2022 alone, Russia's richest oligarchs lost nearly $95 billion combined. That's an average of $330 million lost every single day since the war has started. Some of the most famous oligarchs have seen their fortunes shrink dramatically. Roman Abramovich, who was once the owner of Chelsea FC and one of Russia's most well-known billionaires, lost 57% of his wealth in 2022, dropping $7.8 billion. Abramovich was one of the first to be hit with sanctions by the UK because of his close ties to the Kremlin. His assets in the UK were frozen, cutting him off from a big part of his international wealth. Gennady Timchenko, a longtime friend of Vladimir Putin and major player in the energy sector, Timchenko's net worth fell by 48%. Leaving him with $11.8 billion. His businesses, which rely heavily on oil and gas, have been hurt by Europe buying less Russian energy and by the difficulty of moving money internationally. Suleiman Kerimov, another of Putin's allies, lost 41% of his fortune, bringing his net worth down to $9 billion. His assets were frozen, and losing access to Western markets has hit his investments hard. Not all industries have been affected equally, though. Some oligarchs, especially those involved in military production, are actually doing well, despite the overall economic downturn. Oligarchs with investments in defense and weapons manufacturing are benefiting from the war. As Russia pours money into its military, these businesses are getting more government contracts and seeing higher demands for their products. This has helped shield them from the broader economic problems. Some Russian oligarchs have tried to get around sanctions by moving their businesses to other countries, but it isn't easy. It's expensive and risky. Take Gazprom, for example. It used to be a huge player in Europe's energy market, but now it's had to find new customers in Asia and sell its gas at lower prices. Other businesses that depend on Western partners are also struggling to find new ways to make money. Even though oligarchs are rich and powerful, the sanctions are making it harder for them to keep their wealth. Moving their businesses abroad might offer a way around sanctions, but it comes with high costs and serious risk. So even though they're losing money, the oligarchs probably won't challenge Putin. Over the years, Putin has made sure that they stay loyal to him. He's tied their fortunes to the government, so they depend on him to keep their wealth. Oligarchs who've spoken out against the Kremlin in the past have faced harsh consequences, like being forced to leave the country or even just thrown in jail. This has scared others into staying quiet. While many oligarchs might be unhappy with how things are going, they don't have the power or the courage to stand up to Putin. The financial problems of the oligarchs are also a part of why Russia keeps fighting in Ukraine. Ending the war would cost a lot of money that would be needed to rebuild the military and fix the economy. To pay for this, the government might tax the oligarchs even more, which would hurt them even further. Plus, if the war ends, the oligarchs might try to gain more power, which could shake up the political system. So the Kremlin is trying to balance the costs of war with keeping things stable at home. Pensioners in Russia are facing some of the harshest challenges due to the economic consequences of the ongoing war in Ukraine. Many pensioners in Russia live on fixed incomes, meaning their money doesn't go as far as it used to. This makes them especially vulnerable to the rising prices caused by inflation. For pensioners, this means that essential items like food, medicine, and utilities have become much more expensive. As a result, many pensioners are struggling to afford even the basics they need to survive. For example, last summer, the price of eggs jumped by 42%. This is just one example of how the cost of everyday goods has risen sharply. Other items that pensioners rely on, like bananas, tomatoes, and potatoes, also saw similar price increases. This makes it harder for people on fixed incomes to make ends meet. What's even more difficult is that pensioners don't have the flexibility to earn more money to cope with the rising costs. They can't easily get another job or ask for a raise like someone in the working class might. So many pensioners are being forced to cut back on things they need or choose between paying for food or paying for essential medicines. This has created a lot of stress and hardships for them. The Kremlin knows that pensioners in Russia are struggling as the cost of living keeps rising. During press conferences, officials talk about how hard it is for retirees to afford basics like eggs, which have become a symbol of the country's economic problems. But just talking about the issue doesn't solve it. In fact, it shows the government is worried this could lead to bigger problems, like protests or even political unrest. A good example of this happened in 2018, when the government tried to raise the retirement age. This move sparked protests not just from pensioners, but also from the working class, who feared that they'd face similar cuts in the future. The protests were huge, proving that pensioners can organize and make their voices heard. Even though the government eventually pushed through the reforms, the backlash was a clear warning. Pensioners are a powerful group. If inflation keeps rising and their pensions can't keep up, it's very likely they'll protest again. This could create serious instability for the government. To calm things down, the Kremlin might consider increasing pension payments. This would help keep retirees up with inflation and ease their financial struggles. But this would cost the government more money, and its budget is already stretched pretty thin because of this war. To pay for the increased pension payouts, the government would have to find the money somewhere. One option is to tax the wealthy, like the oligarchs, more heavily. Another is to raise taxes on the working class. You might be thinking, this isn't a bad idea at all, but both choices come with risks. If the oligarchs are taxed too much, they might push back against the government. If taxes go up for the working class, it could undo the economic gains they've been seeing during the war and make them resentful. Another idea is to redistribute wealth by taxing income. This would mean taking some of the profits from the working class and using them to support pensioners. But this could create tensions between workers and retirees. If the working class feels like they're losing out to support pensioners, it could lead to even more unrest. These struggles of pensioners also highlights why Russia can't easily afford to just end the war. YouTube just dropped a mind-boggling announcement. It is paying creators $64 million per day. Why? Well, because YouTube doesn't have enough creators. That is why you see videos on your homepage that have less than 1,000 views, like this one. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everyone should start a channel, but if you have ever wondered about starting a YouTube channel, or a faceless YouTube channel like this one, well, now's the perfect time. YouTube is paying creators millions every day, and it's pushing newer, smaller channels now more than ever. But I'm sure many of you have questions on how to get started and how to grow a channel. We get questions in our email all the time from some of you guys. So that's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one training bootcamp for the low, low price of completely free. So, if you're someone interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can sign up for this bootcamp by clicking on the link in the description or on the screen. Sign up now because, unfortunately, unlike YouTube videos, the bootcamp is like a Zoom call, so it's limited to just 100 people. Okay, let's get back to the video. If the war stops, the government will still face huge economic challenges. It will need money for rebuilding after the war and dealing with economic fallout. This could mean more cuts to pensions or higher taxes, making life even harder for retirees. For years, war spending has kept Russia's economy running, making its sudden disappearance a major concern from the Kremlin. The conclusion of the war in Ukraine would likely trigger a severe economic crisis in Russia, leading to a series of challenges the Kremlin is eager to avoid. One of the biggest concerns for Russia is the sudden end of defense spending, which has become a vital part of its economy during the conflict. In 2025, Russia plans to increase its defense budget by 25%, allocating 13.5 trillion rubles, about $145 billion, which is 6.3% of its GDP. This is the highest defense spending percentage since the Cold War. Such a large investment supports several sectors, including the manufacturing of military equipment like tanks, guns, and ammunition. If the war ends, Russia would face a sharp drop in defense spending. Many factories that currently operate at full capacity to produce military supplies would suddenly slow down or close altogether. This shift would lead to widespread job losses, especially in industries linked to defense. Before the war, Russia's unemployment rate was extremely low, at just 2.3% in October of 2024. With many workers now employed in defense-related jobs, their sudden displacement could push unemployment rates higher, leading to more competition for available jobs. This would likely put downward pressure on wages, as many people search for work in an already tight job market. A reduction in wages would lower the standard of living for many Russians, particularly those who are already struggling with lower incomes. The working class, which has had a relatively stable life during the war, would now face serious economic hardships. This could lead to growing frustration, potentially causing protests and public dissatisfaction. Such unrest would challenge the Kremlin's authority and complicate governance, making it harder for the government to maintain control. The situation is further complicated by the Russian central bank's decision to keep interest rates high, around 20% during the conflict. The high interest rates have been effective in controlling inflation, but they've also discouraged investment in the civilian economy. This has prevented growth and innovation in other sectors. Once the war ends and defense spending drops, there would be a vacuum in the economy, creating a stagnant economy. The economic stagnation, combined with high interest rates, would make life difficult for businesses and consumers. Companies would struggle with high borrowing costs, which could discourage them from expanding or starting new projects. At the same time, consumers might find it harder to afford goods and services, as their wages decline and job security becomes less certain. The Kremlin's reluctance to end the war is, in part, due to the desire to avoid these economic consequences. The defense sector has become so important to the Russian economy that any sudden changes in its funding could have far-reaching effects. The government faces a difficult challenge, managing the transition to a peacetime economy while addressing the social problems that come with such a shift. Shifting from war to stability is no simple task, and the financial strain is becoming harder to ignore. The Central Bank of Russia is currently facing some major challenges in managing the country's economy, especially with the ongoing conflict, having set interest rates at 21% per year. These high rates, which have been in place since late 2024, are meant to control inflation, which was about 10% in early 2025. The central bank is trying to control the rising prices of goods and services, but it is facing difficult choices in the process. One of the main problems with high interest rates is that they make borrowing money more expensive. When businesses need loans to grow or start new projects, high interest rates make them hesitate. As a result, businesses are less likely to borrow money for expansion, which leads to a slowdown in investment. The economy, instead of growing through new business activity, becomes more dependent on military spending to keep it going. Looking ahead, the central bank is projecting that inflation will decrease over time. By 2025, inflation is expected to drop to a range of 4.5% to 7.7%. And they hope to reach the 4.0% target by 2026. To do this, the central bank plans to keep interest rates high, like ranging between 17% and 20%. Another challenge facing Russia's economy is the threat of stagflation. Stagflation is a situation where the economy isn't growing, but prices are still going up. Russia is already showing signs of stagflation, with inflation over 9%, and its economic growth has mostly been driven by high government spending on the military. When the conflict ends, the Russian government is expected to cut back on its spending. Elvira Nabiullina, the governor of the Central Bank of Russia, has received praise for managing the economy during tough times, especially with Western sanctions and inflationary pressure. However, after the conflict ends, she will face even more difficult decisions as she tries to balance the need for economic growth with the risk of causing even more inflation. The current monetary policy of the central bank is a delicate balancing act. The high interest rates are designed to control inflation, but they also suppress investment and make it harder for businesses to grow. After the conflict ends, the government will likely reduce its spending, which could lead to increased unemployment and ongoing inflation. Governor Nabiullina's ability to manage these challenges will play a key role in shaping Russia's economy in the next few years. When the war in Ukraine finally ends, Russia will face a lot of problems that could shake up the country from the inside. The war has already changed Russia's economy in major ways, and stopping the conflict will create a messy situation that could undo a lot of the progress the country has made in recent years. As the war has gone on, Russia has spent a huge amount of money on its military, but when the war ends, the government will likely cut back on defense spending. This means many of these factories will shut down, and thousands of workers could lose their jobs. This sudden shift from low unemployment to mass joblessness will hit people hard, especially in places like Siberia and the Caucasus, where families are already struggling with rising prices and inflation. For many workers, the end of the war could be a disaster. As defense spending drops, the jobs that have kept them employed will disappear, leaving them without a way to support themselves and their families. This could lead to widespread anger and frustration, with people taking to the streets to protest and demand change. Another big problem Russia will face after the war is figuring out what to do with all the veterans returning to civilian life. Over the course of the war, a huge number of soldiers have been sent to fight, and many of them have gotten used to the pay and the benefits that come with being in the military. Going back to regular life won't be easy for them, especially if there aren't many job opportunities waiting for them when they get home. To help with this, the government has tried to support veterans by offering them special programs. For example, in 2023, about 8,500 veterans and their kids were given spots in universities through a special quota. This was meant to help them get an education and find a place in society after the war. But not every veteran will be able to take advantage of these programs. Without enough support, some veterans might feel like the government has forgotten about them. This could lead to anger and frustration, especially if they can't find jobs, get proper health care, or receive the benefits they were promised during the war. The challenges of reintegrating veterans are a huge part of Russia's post-war recovery. If the government doesn't handle this carefully, veterans could become a source of instability, making it harder for the country to move forward after the war. The Kremlin is facing a tough dilemma when it comes to the war in Ukraine, with significant risks on both sides, continuing the war or ending it. On one hand, prolonging the war is causing economic problems, but on the other, stopping it could lead to an immediate economic collapse and social unrest. This is because the war affects Russia's economy, political power, and need for long-term changes, all of which are connected to whether the war continues or ends. Keeping the war going isn't just about military strategy. It's also about keeping key supporters satisfied. The military and working class, two groups that support the government, have benefited from the war. Soldiers are well paid, and their families receive benefits, which keeps them loyal. Workers have seen their wages increase because of labor shortages caused by the war. This has created a false sense of stability that the government relies on to stay in control. If the war ends, soldiers would lose their good pay, and workers would see wages fall as defense spending decreases. This could cause dissatisfaction and even protests, threatening the government's hold on power. While the war fuels loyalty and economic gains for some, ending it could undo the very fabric of stability the government clings to. A sudden stop in military spending would shock the economy, as the artificial boost from the war economy would be removed. This could lead to a recession with rising unemployment and inflation. The need for long-term economic reforms makes the Kremlin's decision even harder. To stabilize the economy after the war, Russia would need to change its economy by investing in civilian industries, rebuilding infrastructure, and reducing military spending. However, these reforms would require a level of openness that could weaken Putin's power. The wealthy oligarchs who have lost some of their wealth during the war might demand political changes in exchange for supporting these reforms. This could lead to a shift in power within Russia, weakening the Kremlin. Additionally, reform efforts would face resistance from groups within the government and the military who benefit from the current situation. Ending the war would also affect the Russian people. Inflation, which has already been a problem during the war, would likely increase as the ruble continues to lose value. This would hurt pensioners and those with fixed incomes, as their money would buy less. The government would have to find ways to ease the impact, like increasing pension payments or subsidizing basic goods. But these measures would require more government spending, putting additional pressure on the budget. The working class, facing lower wages and higher prices, might demand more help from the government, further straining the economy. In the long run, Russia's economy would need to change completely to recover from the war. This would involve shifting resources away from the military and into civilian industries, rebuilding infrastructure, and attracting foreign investment. But the sanctions from the West and the loss of foreign business makes this difficult. Rebuilding the economy would require strong political leadership and tough decisions, like reducing the military's power, which has increased during the war. The Kremlin's choices are also complicated by the political risks of ending the war. The military, which has benefited from the conflict, might resist cuts to defense spending or losing influence. The working class, facing post-war economic challenges, could grow unhappy, especially if they feel the government hasn't protected their interests. The rich oligarchs who have lost money during the war might demand more political power, leading to a shift in Russia's power structure. All of these factors make it harder for the Kremlin to end the war without causing political and economic instability.